You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. People have strong opinions about immigration, and during this presidential election campaign, anxieties over America's broken immigration system and hopes the election might bring change are top of mind for many voters. Some of you have told WUSF you're worried about border security. Others are concerned about the rise in xenophobic rhetoric directed at immigrants. Immigration law is complex, and so is the way the immigration system works and doesn't work. And it's not just immigrant communities who are affected. So today on Florida Matters, we're going to take a bit more time than usual to explore the impact of our immigration system on the Sunshine State. Among the voices you'll hear over the next hour are a DACA recipient whose parents came to the US from Peru and a berry farmer who relies on immigrant workers during harvest season. And just a reminder, as Hurricane Milton is bearing down on Florida's Gulf Coast, WUSF News will be here with updates throughout on 89.7 FM and online at wusf.org. The severity of this oncoming storm cannot be understated. And it's only magnified by the reality that the greater Tampa Bay region was just starting to recover from Hurricane Helene. We want to take a moment to reflect on that. It's been more than a week since the Category 4 storm slammed into the Big Bend, leaving a trail of destruction along the Gulf Coast in its wake. Communities in Tampa Bay that were devastated by storm surge are regrouping. WSF's Octavio Jones has been talking with people in Arapahoe, in Pasco County, and in Hernando Beach. Octavio, what have you seen and who have you been talking to?
My former colleague and friend Kathleen Flynn, who was also a freelance for Reuters, she also worked in the Tampa Bay area, and she sent me a message saying Hernando Beach has been impacted. I couldn't believe it. And she was telling me Hernando Beach, the Hudson area, Tarpon Springs. And I just couldn't believe it because the storm was so way offshore. But of course, the storm surge severely impacted those areas. And when I went down there into Hernando Beach, I just couldn't believe it, just seeing just mounds of debris on the side of the roads. A community where I covered for the Hernando Times for a few years, being in the bureau, I just couldn't believe people who I recognized, cleaning out their garages, having their cars possibly being towed away, bedroom furniture, living room furniture, family pictures scattered everywhere. This is a different Hernando Beach what I remember seeing in years past. We're a charming little community where, you have the mom and pop restaurants, right? You have the American Legions, you have the Elks Lodge, you have, antique shops, you have the marinas there where you would think just normal day-to-day business and daily life would happen, but all of a sudden it was upended by a storm that was miles off the coast.
What are people saying they need then? And did they tell you that they are getting the help they need?
The immediate need, it was temporary shelter, right? People are worried about things they could salvage. Was there just housing available? Of course, food and water, and those immediate needs, those basic necessities that they said they're needing right now. What was encouraging to see was the response that has been taking place already. Just seeing representatives from FEMA down on the ground already, just talking to people. Just see the Hernando County Sheriff's Office out, just helping people, and just volunteers in the community too. So just to see and document how the community was coming together, neighbors helping out neighbors. It seems like quite often people would tell me, actually when Arapahoe and also in Hernando Beach, they would say this. It's interesting how these disasters happens and the neighbors, we become even closer, and people are just sharing their stories and wanting to be comforted. And it was just pretty incredible to see where people may have to start over.
And Octavio, you were just up in the Big Bend last weekend. That's where Helene hit directly. What did you see there, and what's it like to see the impact of the storm in communities along the Gulf Coast that are more than 100 miles apart?
I've never been in sort of a disastrous, war zone. It just sort of reminded me of the pictures and videos you would see because of that. But I hate to say, as if a bomb went off, right? Just to see homes clearly ripped off their foundations, right? I use this kind of analogy where if you have a full beard and you want to give yourself a clean shave, that's exactly what I saw with homes that are sort of on these pylons and stilts, where homes are sort of just ripped off the foundations and pushed maybe 100, 200 yards inland, right, into these marshes. I would talk to people where they would find their appliances like maybe 2 or 3 streets over into somebody else's yard, or kind of sandwiched in between two homes. Just something I have never seen anything like this before in my life. It's just neighborhoods and neighborhoods on end. It just didn't stop. I just kept driving and wanted to see other communities that were impacted, these small little fishing villages, talking to people there, and they said they just couldn't believe it. Their way of life has totally changed for a very long time.
So long recovery there. What about Arapica and Hernando Beach? What do you think the outlook is for Arapica and Hernando Beach? Are they looking at a pretty long recovery?
Yes, and I think a pretty long recovery, but also I think, to be honest, I think the resiliency of the people who live there, right? The common theme that I hear that, we have each other. I keep hearing that. We have our family. We have my spouse, my partner, my kids.
Well, WUSF's Octavio Jones, thanks so much for your reporting, and you can see Octavio's photos from Hernando Beach and Arapica on WUSF.org. Appreciate it. And if you need information about recovery from Hurricane Helene, you can find a list of resources at WUSF.org. Turning now to immigration. Well, WUSF's Nancy Guan has been reporting on immigration this year. Hey, Nancy.
Hey, Matt.
A lot of people have strong opinions about immigration, and in reality, immigration laws are complicated, and how the issue affects Floridians may be quite different than people realize. So let's sort through some misconceptions. And let's start with some terminology. What's the difference between an undocumented immigrant and an asylum seeker?
I'm glad you asked that question because the difference between undocumented immigrants and asylum seekers, that often gets lost in the immigration conversation. First of all, undocumented immigrants, they are people who are in the U.S. without legal authorization. But that could cover a broad swath of people in different scenarios. For example, they could have come into the U.S. undetected. That means they could have came in through the border without being apprehended by Border Patrol agents. Or they could have come to the U.S. with a valid visa, such as a tourist visa or a student visa, and overstayed when that visa expired. To put it simply, undocumented immigrants don't have the legal right to be in the U.S., and they also don't have work authorization. Mm-hmm. Asylum seekers, on the other hand, are actively seeking asylum or that refugee status. So they've either filed an application or intend to file an application to seek asylum. So they're at least on that pathway that could lead to citizenship, because if you receive asylum, you could eventually apply for a green card. But I think it's important to note that people who enter the U.S. without authorization or cross the border legally can apply for asylum. And that's what we're seeing happen at the border.
When people say illegal immigrant, what do they mean?
So the term illegal immigrant is pretty fraught and has been debated for years. In short, it's not a formal term, but it's been used to describe people who do not have the legal right to be in the U.S. We've heard politicians, especially those on the right, use the term illegal immigrant pretty frequently, and I think it's fair to say pretty broadly to stoke fears about the immigrant community. I think it's important to note that the Associated Press actually dropped using the term illegal immigrant back in 2013 because it is imprecise, actually, and can be harmful.
Mm-hmm. So you've been talking with immigrants, advocates, and attorneys about problems with the immigration system. How does the immigration system work for someone in Florida without legal paperwork?
Yeah, I mean, someone who doesn't have legal authorization or legal status, it's really tough. They don't have a social security number, they don't have proper work authorization, so their options are limited. And they do not have access to a lot of social services such as Medicaid unless it's, in the event of an emergency, or SNAP, which provides grocery assistance. But at the same time, a lot of the undocumented community are working in jobs with lower wages. Mm-hmm. So, for example, our agriculture industry depends a lot on undocumented labor. And a farm worker advocate that I spoke with said that a lot of the undocumented farm workers that he's worked with are afraid to speak out against their employer when there's labor abuses. In addition, there's very few pathways to citizenship for undocumented individuals, so a lot of them stay undocumented. DACA recipients is also a group that I've spoken with. To give some background, people in the DACA program, they were people brought into the U.S. as children without legal status. Mm-hmm. But the DACA program lets them stay in the U.S. temporarily. And it gives them a social security, it gives them work authorization, so they can live and work in the U.S. as long as that program is in place. A DACA recipient that I spoke with He really values the benefits, but he also says there's limits, right? So, for example, he's not able to receive federal aid. So, when he wanted to apply for college, he had to look for scholarships, or else higher education would have been very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, he told me, as a child, he was very afraid that his family's status would be exposed. Before the DACA program was created, he didn't even know if he'd be able to go to school, so he was living under a lot of uncertainty and anxiety for his future.
Nancy, you've talked with immigration attorneys in the Tampa Bay region. What have they told you about Florida's huge backlog of immigration cases, asylum cases?
Yeah, so the number of asylum seekers has been surging in recent years, and they've told me that the system simply doesn't work like it did maybe 10 years ago. An attorney that I spoke with who works in Lakeland said that the asylum process used to take 3 to 4 months tops. That's not the case anymore. There's over 2 million pending asylum cases in immigration courts and asylum offices across the U.S., and there's just not enough manpower to handle that volume of cases. They believe, there needs to be more funding, there needs to be more staffing to hire more people who work with asylum cases and in the immigration system, but they're also calling for, policy changes to make the system more efficient and reduce the backlog.
And so you have this massive backlog across the country, but Florida, it's worse, right? Or it's one of the worst affected states in terms of that backlog.
Yes, so in numbers, Florida has the most pending cases. It's close to 180,000.
Mm-hmm. Do they have any sense of how long it's going to take to get through all that?
So according to the data, it would take about 4 years for someone to have their first hearing. That's on par with the national average. But in a lot of cases, people are waiting even longer than that.
What about the impact of Florida's new laws targeting illegal immigration then? How are those laws playing out?
Yeah, so those laws have definitely impacted the immigrant community. I've spoken with advocates and nonprofits that work with immigrants, and they've told me it's created a chilling effect on undocumented immigrants and their family members. Going back to SB 1718, that bill did a number of things. It made it harder to hire undocumented labor, and it also mandated hospitals that receive Medicaid to ask emergency room patients about their immigration status, even though patients can decline to answer. And another major provision that got national attention banned people from transporting or driving undocumented individuals into the state. Although that part of the bill is on hold, it's being blocked by federal courts. But regardless, it's created a chilling effect on the immigrant community. Advocates have told me people have been afraid to go to work. They've been afraid to drive, afraid to seek medical care. And in Florida, we have about 1.2 million undocumented individuals. And it's also important to note that the laws don't only affect them, but it affects their family members. So there's a ripple effect.
Right. Nancy, what about the argument that people coming across the U.S. border illegally are taking advantage of the system by claiming asylum?
That's a great question that's raised by a lot of people who are concerned about the backlog. I think to just give a primer on asylum, in order to claim asylum, you have to be either present in the U.S. or at an official port of entry. That can be an official entrance along the border or at an airport. What we're seeing is large numbers of people are entering the U.S. unlawfully or between ports of entry to claim asylum. And they can do that. If you're on U.S. soil and you have a fear of returning to your home country because of persecution, the U.S. has a legal obligation to hear that asylum claim. But as we know, the system is overwhelmed and people are having to wait years for that decision to be made. And some attorneys that I've spoken with say that this has given the impression that the U.S. is somewhere where you can claim asylum and stay. Mm-hmm. And naturally, that's become a pull factor for migrants. But it doesn't mean that it was easy to get to the border or that they aren't fleeing really dire situations in their home countries. I think as long as the system is overwhelmed, people will have to wait years for a decision on their asylum claim, and that's not ideal. So that's why there's a push for some kind of immigration reform to make the asylum system more efficient and less of this waiting room.
And that push has been going on for a long time, like years and years, with not too much progress.
Yes.
Another notion you'll hear is that higher immigration, and especially undocumented people coming to the United States, leads to more crime. Is there any truth to that notion?
So the research shows that there isn't a correlation between immigrants and higher levels of crime. Studies show actually the opposite. There's a Stanford University study that analyzed decades of data, and they found that immigrants are actually 60% less likely to be incarcerated. There's another study done by the Cato Institute that looked at crime data in Texas, and that showed that undocumented immigrants are 37% less likely to be convicted of a crime. And there's also the misconception that immigrants are bringing in large amounts of fentanyl and drugs through the border, but the Department of Homeland Security have said that a vast majority of fentanyl and other drugs are coming through official ports of entry or are brought in by U.S. citizens.
Another argument against immigrants, and we know that folks have economic concerns top of mind, especially in an election year. Some people say they're taking away jobs from Americans. What are you hearing about that in your reporting?
Yeah, so that's also an assumption that's been essentially debunked by research. There's a report by the Economic Policy Institute that states in 2023, we saw the immigrant share of the labor market reach a record high of 18.6%. At the same time, the unemployment rate, U.S.-born people, hit a record low of about 3.6%. So what that study suggests is that, immigrants aren't necessarily displacing U.S. workers. They're being absorbed by the labor force.
And there's also this argument floating around sometimes that undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes. What can you tell us about that?
So undocumented immigrants do pay taxes. There was a recent report by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy that shows in Florida, undocumented immigrants actually paid $1.8 billion in taxes. And a lot of that comes from sales tax and excise tax because we don't have an income tax here. So undocumented immigrants, like other citizens, they buy goods and services and they contribute to the economy that way. Another thing is immigrants, even without legal status, they're able to get an ITIN, an individual taxpayer identification number, and they can file taxes that way. So they can pay federal and state taxes. At the same time, they're not able to access a lot of the social services that receive money from taxes. So essentially, they're paying into a system that benefits mainly people with legal status.
Right. In your reporting, Nancy, what have immigrants and people who work in the system told you that they want? What do they want to change? What are their goals and dreams?
Yeah, I think everyone at least wants the asylum system to work. The immigrants that I've spoken with, they don't like living in this uncertainty. A lot of the people that I spoke with, they've fled violence and poverty and just really dangerous situations. So they want to be able to have an answer. Similarly, attorneys, they've said that their workload has increased over the years because of this backlog. And it's become harder for asylum officers to, make accurate decisions on cases at times. For years, the departments that deal with asylum and immigration, they haven't been funded properly, they haven't been staffed properly. So there needs to be some kind of immigration reform.
Mm-hmm. And politicians on both sides are focusing on immigration, sometimes resorting to fear tactics. Do you have some trusted resources where people can get data and information to help make informed decisions, say at the ballot box?
I would just say to do your research. Don't rely on social media or Facebook. One of my go-to websites is PolitiFact, where they give really neutral kind of assessments on what politicians might say about immigration. So I highly recommend that. The Migration Policy Institute is also a really good resource that explains how the immigration system works.
WSF's Nancy Guan covering immigration. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Matt.
You're listening to Florida Matters and an exploration of how America's broken immigration system affects our state. Up next, a third-generation berry farmer explains the role of immigrant workers in agriculture and how that might change. You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. Gary Wisnatsky, you're a third-generation berry farmer, and you're the owner of Wish Farms in eastern Hillsborough County. Now, your company is more than 100 years old. What's your main crop, and how has that changed in the time you've been there?
Yeah, here in Florida, our main crop is strawberries. We market a lot of berries from around the, North and South America, as well as what we grow here ourselves and our partner growers here in Florida. And I'm the third generation in the business, which was over 100 years old now. My grandfather started in 1922, but I'm actually the first generation farmer.
Okay. So you were involved in some, or your forebears were involved some other way before that?
Yeah, I started in 1974, so I've been in the strawberry industry for over 50 years. In 1987 is when we started our own company-owned farm, but we've been very connected with all the local growers for over 100 years.
Mm-hmm. And it's hard work, right? You got to bend down. It's like it's literally kind of backbreaking labor.
Yeah, it's not a job that you raise your children to do. And we have immigrant people coming in that do the work either on H-2A visas now or just people that were coming here just looking for work. But the fact of the matter is it is hard work, and the future, I believe, is in automation, not in picking strawberries like we do today. Mm-hmm. But this has been done for hundreds of years, and this hasn't changed in all that time.
And I want to get into automation in a bit, but before that, just give us a sense of how big your farms are in the Tampa Bay area and beyond, and how much fruit they produce.
Yeah, so we're producing about a little over 5 million boxes of strawberries here, which is about 40 million pounds of strawberries in Florida, plus what we do in processing. So we're in the neighborhood of 50 million pounds of strawberries in totality here in Florida. And then in California, we're also growing about 5 million boxes of strawberries and marketing.
So back to how those strawberries are harvested, how reliant are you on migrant labor, and has that always been the case?
Yeah, we're greatly reliant on the migrant labor. Without people here to pick, we lose the crop, and we experienced that back in the 2000 time frame where people just weren't showing up anymore, and we lost crops like early in the season in January because we didn't have enough people to pick them. So,
sorry, which year was this?
That was in the late 2000s, so around 2007 and 8. We were experiencing labor shortages pretty frequently, and that's about the time we turned to H-2A labor to bring in guest workers.
Right, because migrant labor, I mean, my understanding is that in agricultural work, it tends to be more kind of teams of folks who are American and were just kind of traveling from state to state. And that may still be the case, but it's not so much the case now. Yeah,
historically that was the case. And even back before we had people coming here from Mexico to pick the crops, we had just domestic people that were following the crops. And back in those days, they called them fruit bums. But that was back in the 40s and 50s. And back in early days in Plant City, actually, a lot of the labor was actually from the families themselves. The size of your farm was dictated by the size of the family, because the more children you had, the more pickers you had. And there was something known as the strawberry schools in eastern Hillsborough County that kids went to school during the summertime so they could be out during the winter to pick the crops.
So you had a lot more small family farms, and I guess things have changed now. The economies of scale mean that you've got much bigger operations like yours, and you then have to think about where are you going to find the folks you need to harvest the fruit.
Yes, back when I started in the 1970s, a pretty good-sized farm was 50 acres. Now your average farm is more like 100 acres. Our company-owned farm down in Duet, which is in northern Manatee counties, we're growing about 700 to 800 acres of strawberries there every year. And the rule of thumb is you need about one person per acre to keep up with the harvest. A lot of people don't know this, but strawberries don't ripen, and one of the few fruits that don't ripen after they've been picked. So you have to pick it at the right stage of ripeness. We have to go through the fields every 3 to 4 days to pick off the ripe fruit And so we're making 40 passes during a season. And so it takes a lot of labor. It takes a lot of people to keep up with keeping the right fruit cleaned off.
And so just based on the acreage you're talking about, you need 700 to 800 workers per season.
That's correct, yes.
When you hear, or if you hear people say that immigrants are stealing American jobs, what do you think?
They're not. I remember during that 2008 period that I was talking about, when we were short labor and we were advertising in the newspaper, you'd have domestic people come out, and the rule of thumb was they don't last a day. Most of them didn't last an hour trying to pick strawberries. So the thing that a lot of folks don't realize, too, is that we're paying on a piece rate. So the piece rate, of course, you have to make sure that the people make above minimum wage, and most of our workers always do, and if they don't, we have to make up the difference. So, but you have to have a delta between the minimum wage and what they can earn. So if our minimum wage is 18, we've got to set the piece rates at where the average worker can make $25, $28 an hour. And that's the thing that folks don't understand. If you put somebody out in the field on a piece rate picking strawberries, say at a $5 piece rate, and they only pick one flat an hour, now that box of strawberries not costing you $5, it's costing you $15 because you've got to make up the difference in the minimum wage.
So they've got to be good at what they do.
Yeah, so we're looking for folks that can be efficient, and actually everybody wins when they're making good boxes per hour because they can make well above minimum wage, and it's keeping our costs at a reasonable number that we can compete.
What's the process like of hiring workers through the H-2A program? How easy is it?
Yeah, the H-2A program has been around for a very long time, and it's a broken system. And I say that because when it was designed as a means of last resort for growers to get workers. And so it was designed to be a little onerous and not very friendly to the folks that used it because they wanted it to be difficult and expensive, which it is.
Because they want you to hire American workers.
That's correct. Well, the fact is now here in Florida, we cannot get workers that are domestic. The only way we get the crops picked at a larger scale is with H-2A workers. Now, if you had a small farm, you might find 2 or 3 people that can do the work, 5 people that can do the work. But to find a crew of 600 people, there's no way you're going to hire enough domestic people. So we're 100% reliant on H-2A. And that's why I think H-2A needs to be fixed. We're paying a higher minimum wage. It's called an adverse effect wage rate, acronym folks in the industry call AWR. So the AWR right now, I believe, is being set around a couple dollars, $2 or $3 higher than minimum wage. So we're actually paying these guest workers higher than domestic workers were required to pay. If we had a domestic workforce, we pay less. We also have to pay to get them here. We have to pay for their housing. We have to make sure that they get to the grocery store and have transportation. So there's a lot of added cost to bringing in these guest workers. And so it's not by choice.
So does it seem to you that if you look at the H-2A system and how that works or doesn't work, is that a part of a bigger system that's broken? Or is this just one thing that you're focused on and you're kind of seeing some of the flaws because you have to work within this H-2A visa program? Or is this just an example of how the broader immigration system in America is broken?
Absolutely. I mean, I think most people would agree that we need secure borders and that we also need to have the ability to bring workers in and for people to immigrate here and for the population to remain, growing to some degree. So, we do need immigrants, and all of our families were immigrants. So, I absolutely think that we have a system, though, that doesn't provide for a fair way for folks to get in. For people in Mexico and other countries to get a visa, it takes many, many years if they do it the legal way, and that's why they're coming here the way they're coming here now. But we've got to get that under control. It's a big problem, I think, for the country.
We've heard that Florida's immigration laws like SB 1780 are having an impact on some companies. that hire immigrant workers? Is it impacting your company at all?
No, it's not impacting us because we're currently, just about all guest workers. That's the only way, like I said before, we could get the work done. So some medium-sized growers might be impacted. Really small growers don't have any need to comply with the
Right. I think the minimum is 25 employees.
That's right. So it's that those growers that are kind of in that middle range that may be affected. We don't have any growers like that are being affected adversely.
And what about the E-Verify requirements of the law? I mean, is that a concern for your company?
No, it's not. I mean, we've always done everything by the letter of the law. So I'm not. It hasn't been a problem, and the fact that we've got all guest workers, there's no reason that we have to worry about anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Some of the things you've outlined, like, for example, people's concerns about security of the border, the long time it takes to get a visa, whether it's an H-2A visa or another way to come to America legally, and then kind of the other issues like people saying immigrants are stealing American jobs. I mean, these are things that are all swirling around this debate over immigration. There's a lot of heat, maybe not so much light. What do you think it would take for people to kind of take a step back and look at the problem and try and solve it without some of the rhetoric?
The rhetoric is, that's politics, and I try not to get too involved in that. I just try to mind my own business and do what we do is grow strawberries.
Mm-hmm. And the future for Wish Farms, you mentioned automation. That's something you've thought a lot about. So what is happening there, and when is that going to start rolling out on a big scale?
I truly believe that automation is the only path forward. Like I said before, the demographics are such, the birth rates are shrinking across the globe. There is not going to be enough people that are going to do this kind of work. And young people, rightfully so, are looking for better, higher paying jobs that are, not that we're paying low wages, but I'm talking about easier jobs, desk jobs, air conditioned jobs. People don't want to work in the fields and stoop over all day.
So you have put some effort into seeing what you can do with automation. And I know that from conversations we've had before this, that you are looking into rolling out some automation in your operations already. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Automation is the future. We started back in 2013 and 14 is when we really started working on this automation project. Harvest Crew Robotics, that's CROO, Crew. We are developing a robotic picker. I've co-founded this company with a robotic engineer, Bob Pitzer, and we are working on a way to automatically pick strawberries. We've got the machines that are doing it now. This season, we expect that we'll have our first year that we'll be doing some commercial picking, and it's been quite a journey developing this. But if we don't have automation, there is going to be a situation, I believe, in this country that strawberries become a luxury item. If you have to pay much higher wages, growers in Florida and California are already struggling for a lot of different reasons. Our inputs and our labor costs we're not able to keep up on the sales side with what we're able to sell the crop for versus what it's costing us to grow it. And it's already heading in that direction. With free market economy, it's going to maybe take a couple years to really happen, where growers are going out of business, and then there's less berries, and then the price of berries are much higher. So, and I think that's across a lot of sectors in produce and in fresh fruits and vegetables, that we need automation in order to keep up, especially on these labor-intense crops like strawberries.
So with that in mind, what does the future look like in terms of the role of immigrant workers? Like, what role do you see immigrant workers playing on Wish Farms 10, 20, 30 years from now in the wider industry?
Yeah, so the workers that have been at the farm that want to stay at the farm, and domestic people that want to work there, there's going to be jobs for the future. I mean, and even once the robotic harvesting becomes a reality, which it will be soon, there will still be a transition time for many years. So during that transition, a lot of these folks, I can envision them in transitioning to technician jobs, to other jobs. I mean, who's better to do these farm jobs than people that are familiar with the farm and familiar with the crop? Mm-hmm. So I see, these better, easier, physically easier jobs that are going to be available to folks that want to stay and work at the farm. So I think the future is bright. I think the future I'm trying to avoid with our automation project is that we don't have unaffordable berries. So I think there's a lot of things happening now. The technology is really caught up. It's really incredible. Even when we started that a little over 10 years ago, there was things that we're doing now that we couldn't do back then because of the advances with the technology.
Mm. Gary Wisnatsky, third-generation berry farmer and owner of Wish Farms in eastern Hillsborough County. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate the time.
You're listening to Florida Matters. Still to come, you'll meet two people with a deep understanding of how immigration law impacts immigrant communities and non-immigrants alike. You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. Immigration is a top issue for voters this election. Some of you have told WSF you're concerned about border security, and others are worried about the rhetoric directed at immigrants. To some, there's no middle ground. The reality is, though, immigration laws are complex, and how it affects Floridians is far from simple. You're about to meet two people with a deep understanding of the far-reaching impacts of state and federal immigration laws. Diego Dulanto Falcon, you're a college student and a recipient of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. And just a note, Florida has the fifth most DACA recipients in the United States. According to the United States Customs and Immigration Service, it's 21,080 as of December last year. That's behind California, Texas, Illinois, and New York. So when did you become a DACA recipient?
So it was around when I was like 16 or 17, and it had been a couple of years since DACA was implemented. Mm-hmm. But me and my family, we didn't know what it was, and we didn't really have anyone to explain it. So we held off on actually applying just because we were afraid that it might have been a scam, because we had been scammed before when it came to whether it was immigration attorneys or just attorneys in general telling us how we can get citizenship. Mm-hmm. So I could have became a DACA recipient at 15, but we waited a couple of years.
And how many years ago was that?
I think 8 or 9 years ago now.
Okay. So for people who don't know how it works, what does it mean to be a DACA recipient?
So it basically means you have temporary protections from deportation. You are allowed a work permit, which is also referred to as an EAD, an employment authorization document, and you're allowed to attend public schools. That's pretty much it. Obviously, since I'm not in public schools anymore, I'm in higher education. What really works for me is just the work permit and the temporary protections from deportation.
I guess the operative word there is temporary, right? Do you feel like you've got a bit of a toehold, but is there a sense of uncertainty about it all?
Yeah, especially now with DACA being in federal court, and we don't really know when we're going to hear back about a decision about whether or not DACA is going to stay. We're kind of just on the fence every single day waiting to hear about a decision.
Now, you describe yourself in your biographical description as a 1.5 generation migrant. What do you mean by that?
So there's first generation, 1.5 generation, and second generation. And first generation is, and Dr. Aranda can correct me if I'm wrong, but they are immigrants who migrated here after the age of 13 or 15.
First generation, anyone foreign born.
Foreign born, okay. And then 1.5 generation is usually the children of migrants who they're foreign born, but they had a completely different experience when they migrated here. So first generation is essentially like my parents. Mm-hmm. They came here and they had to deal with all the ramifications. Meanwhile, me, I'm 1.5 generation. I came here when I was 4, and I don't remember anything about migrating here. And then second generation is just children of immigrants who were born here. So my sister, she's a U.S. citizen. She was born here. But my parents are first gen.
The United States immigration system does have a lot of problems, including long wait times for people seeking asylum, other legal status, even visas. Where does DACA fit into that?
DACA was I mean, it was an executive decision that Obama had implemented. And right off the gate, it wasn't even a full month after DACA was implemented where Republicans were actively trying to dismantle it and fight it in court. So as far as like how it works and how well it works, it was supposed to be a temporary solution. It was never supposed to stay this long. You know, they were always trying to fight, and when I mean they, I mean like politicians, whoever, you know, whether Democrat or Republican, they were always trying to fight for a permanent solution to getting a pathway to citizenship. But it just never came to fruition because DACA was always being fought in court, and even till today.
Elizabeth Aranda, you're a sociology professor at the University of South Florida, and you study immigrant well-being. So when we talk about immigration policy, who does it affect? Is it just immigrants?
No, not at all. It affects all of us. But in particular, we have a lot of mixed status families in this country, and those are families where different members might have a different legal status, including being U.S. citizens like your family, Diego. And so what the research finds is that we tend to think that immigration policies only affect immigrants, but there are what we call spillover effects, meaning that the policies intended for immigrants also affect U.S. citizens.
You're studying the impacts of Florida's law that cracks down on illegal immigration. That's SB 1718. For folks who may be not so familiar with that law, can you kind of summarize what it does?
Yeah, it does a number of things. For starters, it criminalizes anyone who brings an undocumented immigrant across state lines. So, for example, if you have a family driving and people have different statuses, they might be a family, but the person driving, if there's an undocumented immigrant in the car, they could be charged with human trafficking. Now, that right now is being litigated in the courts, that aspect of it. It also mandates the use of E-Verify for certain kinds of employers. I'm not sure the number of employees that they have to have. It bars people who have DACA from practicing law. It also requires hospitals that receive Medicaid funds. They're mandated to ask people's legal status when they come in for services. So it has a number of provisions like that. And yes, my research team fielded a survey this summer to see what the impacts of that law were 1 year after it was passed.
What are the preliminary findings of your research so far?
Preliminary findings, about 46% of respondents knew someone who left the state because of the law. I'll just sort of touch on some of the highlights. 37% reported that the law had led to the separation of their families. And one interesting thing about this was that we also interviewed people who were U.S. citizens but were adult children of immigrants. And of that portion of the sample, 23%, so these are U.S. citizens, reported that the law led to family separation. 50% said that the law increased the financial stress in their households, and for U.S.-born citizens, that was 32% of them. 50% said the law had caused changes in their living conditions, like food insecurity, and that affected about a quarter of U.S. citizens in our sample. 55% said the law had increased their emotional or psychological stress in their families. That was actually about 40% for U.S.-born citizens. So you're seeing the spillover effects of the law right there in those findings. Most said that the law had made them think twice about seeking medical care if they had to go to the hospital, which is an alarming number because that indicates that, it's a public health issue for sure. And 40% said that they feared detention or deportation, and of that number, 64% said that the fears had gotten worse in the last year due to the law. So the takeaway for me is immigrant communities are in distress. We did find some differences in the countries of origin in terms of how distressed they were. And the spillover effects on U.S.-born citizens are definitely present in our data.
I think the argument you might hear from folks who say, well, this law is needed is that, well, the immigration system is broken, people are coming into the country illegally, something needs to be done. So what would you say to them, or how do you think you would present some of your findings to those folks?
Well, by focusing, my research focuses on immigrant well-being. So I look at the humanitarian aspect of it. That said, there are other policies that could be passed that could fix the immigration system that doesn't involve criminalizing people who, for the most part, have been here a long time. So, most undocumented immigrants have been in the country 10 or more years. These are people with roots, they're settled, they contribute to the economy. So if we really want to come up with policies that would solve the broken immigration system, I don't think these are the ones that we want to pass because, like I said, there are effects that spill over and affect other populations that the law doesn't intend to affect, yet it does nonetheless.
Yeah, and just back to SB 1718, the E-Verify portion of that law, employers have to have 25 employees at least for them to, have to fulfill that part of the law. I wanted to ask, though, about Florida's kind of makeup as a population, though. 1 in 5 Floridians are immigrants. About 1.3 million undocumented immigrants live in Florida, so that's about 1 in 18 people. Do you think most Floridians realize this?
I don't think so. I think that people have a certain conception of what an immigrant is, what an immigrant looks like, what an immigrant does. And I think the heightened sort of nativism that we've been seeing in this country in the past 5 to 10 years, certainly it's not new. We have seen this historically, but it's been very much sort of out there in the open. And I think the recent events in Springfield, Ohio are testament to that. This vilification of immigrants, I think, is particularly pernicious. And so people, when they think of immigrants, they think of like the other, people not like me. And that's the furthest from the truth. In fact, most people can trace their origins to immigrant backgrounds. So I don't know that folks are really aware of how prevalent and how large the immigrant population is in this country, and specifically in the state of Florida. We're one of those gateway states.
Is this just an election year issue then? When you talk about one of the candidates' policies, there's obviously a lot more focus on immigration because we're in a presidential election year. Is it different this year than, say, 2022, 2023?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think immigration is one of those topics that's a good dog whistle for some folks. The fact is that border crossings right now are down, comparing in the last 4 to 8 years because of a number of measures that the Biden administration has taken, like parole in place, like giving parole to certain countries of origin so that they're not at the border.
But didn't they go up, like at the start of the Biden administration? Didn't those border crossings go up?
Right, but I believe now at this point in time they're down. And there's a lot of factors that play in to people at the border. It's not just U.S. policies, but it's also labor market demand, the fact that companies need workers, so that's also a magnet, but it's also push factors in countries of origin where there's civil unrest, there's high rates of violence, there's political corruption. All of those factors sort of are a perfect storm for people to leave. If you ask me, nobody really wants to leave their home. If they're leaving, it's for a really good reason. So we need to have more well-rounded policies to deal with this and not necessarily use immigration as an issue that we use to scapegoat people to take their minds off of other issues, for example, climate change. We saw this week Hurricane Helene. The havoc that's caused is far greater than what an increase in border crossings would cause. Yet why do we, or some politicians sort of cling to this one issue as a way to sort of scapegoat this population for America's other problems?
Diego, how do you think the 2024 presidential election changes the way people think and talk about immigration in Florida?
Well, honestly, it paints a really divided picture on something that really shouldn't be an issue. Immigrants have been coming into this country for literal centuries, but for whatever reason, now it's an issue all of a sudden. Going back to what Dr. Aranda said about sort of the labor markets, there's this rhetoric that, immigrants are taking our jobs, but at the same time, immigrants are doing the jobs that nobody else wants to do. I don't see any U.S. citizens out in the fields picking strawberries for Florida, same with any other kind of fruit. And these are seasonal jobs where they migrate from Florida to other states as well. On top of that, for me, growing up undocumented, I was helping my parents clean buildings. We were glorified janitors, and I didn't see any U.S. citizens doing that kind of job. We're doing the jobs that nobody else wants to do, but for whatever reason, we're being vindicated for that. And on top of that, it's also even looking at the presidential debate, how Trump was talking about how Haitians are eating like animals, which is completely false. It's just painting such a nasty picture on a population that did not deserve it. We are not here because we want to be here. We're here because we kind of have to. For me, it was for me and my family migrating here, it was because of economic reasons. But I know for a lot of other immigrants, like Palestinians, for example, they're coming here because of war. Same with a lot of Middle Eastern countries, even Central American as well. I know South American countries that are facing dire economic instability in their countries. So we are being forced to come here because it is a safe haven to a certain extent. But that safe haven is turning into a hell for a lot of people.
And your family's from Peru originally.
Yeah. And that goes a long way in the way of talking about where people are coming from, because Peru is not so much like it's not incredibly dangerous, but there are economic reasons that go beyond our control that force us to migrate to somewhere where we might at least have a chance of living a decent life.
When you think about immigration reform, what does that look like to you?
I mean, the very radical version is dismantling the entire immigration system, because we've had it for over 100 years. It has not worked, and it's only gotten worse. But at the same time, there are some, placeholder solutions that could be implemented to at least make it work for the time being. But again, these are placeholder solutions, temporary solutions that would not work in the long run.
Like DACA, for example.
Right. So permanent solutions, it'd be difficult to think of one because the U.S. is so divided. There would be no one fix-all type of solution. But it would be nice to see some sort of pathway to citizenship. I know before the 90s, before 9/11, it was possible to get your citizenship if you resided within the U.S. for at least 5 years. That is how my uncle got his citizenship, but unfortunately me and my family, we came after 9/11. And trying to become a citizen, even just being an immigrant in the U.S. became that much harder.
And is that for folks who come here like with a visa in the first place?
No.
So, because I think people listening to this, if they have an opinion on immigration, they think, look, the system's broken. They might hear that and think, well, why should somebody be able to come here without a visa, stay for 5 years, and become a citizen? How is that right?
It's just a matter of fact that they're contributing to society because, they have to work, right? Whether it's under the table or whatever the situation may be, they have to work. So they are constantly contributing to society. Mind you, immigrants are paying billions of dollars in taxes every year, whether they're undocumented or not. If they're still in the country and they haven't committed any crimes, what harm is being done? Those are just two matter of facts of like, what else do I have to be a U.S. citizen? Like I'm contributing to society and I haven't done anything wrong,
Elizabeth, what do you wish people knew about immigrants and immigration?
Well, I would say two things. One is a longer answer, and the other one is a shorter one. So I'll spare you the longer one, but I'll give you the shorter one. I think it's this idea that immigrants are the other, and they're not. Immigrants are like any other person. Most people, they get up, they go to work, they try to make a living to support their families, and that is not something that divides U.S. citizens from immigrants. So in that regard, I wish people understood that there are more similarities than differences. And if maybe we thought that way, we would be thinking of more proactive solutions rather than vilifying a certain population.
Diego, what do you wish, or what would you like Floridians to know about immigrant communities in the state?
I would say just that, like, we're so diverse. I often hear the stereotype of like, oh, all immigrants are Mexicans, like specifically like in Florida and Texas, when that is just so far from the truth. I've met immigrants from all over the world, and we're just such a diverse, community. And it also goes without saying that, especially in allyship, I see a lot of people tend to speak on behalf of immigrants when in reality, there's just not enough spaces for us to feel safe enough to be able to speak about our own experiences and stories and advocate for ourselves. I would just, if you care about the immigrant community, specifically the undocumented community, and you want to be an ally, I would say just help create safer spaces for immigrants to come forward about their experiences and what it's really like living in this country, whether you're undocumented or not.
So what does the future hold for you?
Well, I'm hoping and, fingers crossed, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to be able to make it through my final year in my master's program. And afterwards, I'm hoping to do a lot of nonprofit community organizing with grassroots organizations, hopefully up in D.C., but anywhere in the metro area works for me.
Well, Diego Dulanto Falcon is a college student and DACA recipient. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Elizabeth Aranda, Professor of Sociology at the University of South Florida. She's researching the impact on immigrant communities of Florida's SB 1718 law, which targets illegal immigration. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's Florida Matters for this week. The executive producer is Grayson Doctor. The video producer is Scott Wachtler. Engineering support from Dave Anderson and Jackson Harp. Subscribe to Florida Matters wherever you get your podcasts. Watch on YouTube and find more at wusf.org. And a reminder that WUSF has the latest coverage of Hurricane Milton and will be there for you throughout the storm on 89.7 FM and on wusf.org. And you can call in and share your experience of this storm and questions about recovery during Florida Matters live special coverage Thursday afternoon. I'm Matthew Petty. Thank you for listening.